It felt like a normal evening at first. I was finishing small things around the house, nothing unusual. But then I noticed something that quietly stayed with me. He looked at me for a moment, as if he wanted to say something but chose not to. That pause felt heavier than I expected. Sometimes I think he doesn't really understand, that he's still too young to notice these things. But silence like that usually carries more than words. Sometimes I think he doesn't really understand, that he's still too young to notice these things. But silence like that usually carries more than words.
That day stayed with me longer than I expected. It wasn't about what he did. It was about what I almost failed to feel.
My name is Clara. I am a mother who is still learning to understand many things, especially the ones that don't always show themselves clearly. That morning felt like any other. I prepared breakfast while thinking about what needed to be bought. My mind felt full before the day had even begun. My child sat at the table. He held his bread but didn't eat it right away. I noticed for a moment, then returned to what I was doing. My thoughts were filled with things that needed to be done: bills, household needs, and small tasks that never seemed to end. I stayed focused on keeping everything in order. He looked at me for a moment, as if he wanted to say something important, but I didn't really stop to notice. As a mother, I often feel like I have to stay strong. I try to handle everything without letting anything fall apart. Without realizing it, I moved through the day too quickly. The day continued as usual. I cleaned, washed, and tidied the house. Everything felt normal, nothing out of place. Until later. I remembered that small moment from the morning. It stayed in my mind longer than I expected, and somehow it felt different. I try to recall his expression more clearly. There was something slightly different, though I didn't name it then. Now it returns to me in quiet fragments. He didn't seem upset, but something felt held back. His calm didn't feel complete. It was as if he was choosing silence carefully. I began to notice the smaller things. His voice was softer than usual. The quiet around him felt different that day. While I was sweeping, he sat quietly in the corner. His hands held the toy, but he wasn't really playing. I noticed, but I stayed where I was. Maybe I've been too quick to assume everything is fine. No tears often feels like no problem, but what matters doesn't always show itself.
As a mother, I tend to wait for clear signs, something obvious that tells me to act. But children don't always speak that way.
A quiet thought begins to form. Not something loud, but persistent. A sense that I might have missed something small, but important. And that feeling doesn't pass. It stays quietly in the background. Over time, it becomes clearer without needing words. He stood close again that afternoon. I could feel his presence without turning. It felt like he was waiting for something from me. He took a small breath, like he was preparing. His eyes met mine for a moment, then dropped. Something paused between us without words. I kept folding the clothes in my hands. It felt easier to finish what I started. I assumed he would speak when he was ready, but he didn't say anything. He slowly stepped away without a sound. The room felt different after he left. That was when a quiet discomfort appeared. I couldn't name it clearly, but it stayed with me. I tried to move past it quietly, telling myself it was nothing serious. Maybe I was just overthinking a small moment. But deep down, something felt unfinished. A quiet awareness stayed under everything else. I knew I had missed something important. That night, the moment stayed in my mind. Not what he said, but what he held back. And somehow, that felt heavier. I began to recall his small habits, the little things he used to do without thinking. Somehow, they feel quieter now. He used to ask questions about everything, simple thoughts shared without hesitation. Now, those moments seem to fade. I didn't notice when it started changing. It happened slowly, without any clear sign, almost like it slipped past me. Then something became clear to me. He wasn't avoiding me. He was choosing silence. And that choice didn't come from strength. It came from learning to hold things inside, quietly on his own. Maybe he saw how busy I was. Maybe he didn't want to interrupt. Maybe he thought this was helping. That's when I finally understood. He wasn't just being quiet. He was trying to protect me, carrying things that were never his to carry, holding back words that should have been spoken, and somehow that felt heavier than silence itself. That night, I chose to sit beside him without bringing anything with me. I wasn't trying to fix or guide the moment. I just wanted to be there, fully. I didn't ask anything right away. I joined his small world instead, following his pace. Letting the moment unfold without pressure felt unfamiliar, but right. Minutes passed and neither of us said a word. Yet something softened in the silence. It no longer felt empty. I spoke gently, choosing my words with care. I told him he could share anything whenever he was ready. The space between us stayed open. He didn't respond right away, but he looked at me for a moment longer than usual, and somehow that felt like enough. I began to understand that not everything needs to be spoken immediately. Some feelings need time before they find words. Holding space became more important than answers. I started changing how I showed up for him. Not just being around, but being emotionally available. It required more awareness than effort. It didn't begin with a big conversation. It started with something small and quiet, sitting and truly listening. I began to understand something I had overlooked. My child was not waiting for perfect answers. She was quietly searching for a sense of safety in me. Safety is not built with explanations. It grows in moments where nothing feels rushed or dismissed. I started to see how silence can either close or open a heart. For a long time, I thought fixing things was my role. I kept trying to make everything better, but she was never asking for solutions. I used to think she didn't notice much, that she was still too young to understand. Now I see how much she quietly absorbs. She reads the room before she speaks. She notices tension before it's named, and she adjusts herself without being asked. Sometimes she responds with a calm that feels too mature, as if she is trying to protect something fragile, and that realization stayed with me. I began to look beyond what she says, to notice pauses, small shifts, and quiet choices. There was always more beneath the surface. It changed how I show up for her, not in big gestures, but in small, steady presence. Slowly, I am becoming the place she can rest in. I used to think being a mother was about managing everything well, keeping the house running, keeping everyone okay. But slowly, I began to see there was something deeper I had been missing. Children don't always say what they feel out loud, not because they don't want to, but because they are still learning how to hold things inside. And sometimes they choose silence without us noticing. I started to realize that they learn more from what we show than what we say, from how we react, how we carry ourselves, even in moments we think they are not paying attention. So I began to pause more often, not just moving from one task to another, but allowing myself to truly notice what is happening around me. I tried to listen without rushing to respond, even in ordinary moments that used to feel unimportant. Those small spaces began to feel different. I don't want my child to feel like they have to carry things alone. I want them to know they are allowed to feel without holding everything back. And I understand now, it starts with me. Not by fixing everything, but by being a place they can return to. Quiet, steady, and safe. That night, I held her a little longer than usual. Not because something happened, but because I felt like I needed to. In the quiet, I realized how rare these small moments have become. I began to understand that silence is not always empty. Sometimes it carries things that words cannot hold. And I wondered how often I had missed that before. Being a mother is not only about listening when they speak, it is about noticing what changes before anything is said, and staying present long enough to see it. If something feels different, maybe it is worth pausing for a moment. Not to fix it, but to gently see it. Sometimes that is already enough. I am Clara, still learning these quiet lessons every day. This is not a perfect journey, just a real one. And if this feels familiar, maybe you are not alone either.